Welcome to our continuing discussion of personality, where we'll build on what we've already introduced in the psychodynamic perspective. We'll flesh this out with more contemporary and alternative perspectives to explain our personality, how we think and act consistently across situations. We'll also talk about personality measurement. What are the more common ways that personality is measured these days, and where is the future of personality measurement? How likely is it that we'll get better and that people will like it more? This and more coming up. Going back to the first week of the semester, we introduced different perspectives in psychology. And I think personality is a great time to reintroduce those. We need to address the question of why we need multiple perspectives. And which one do you find the most helpful? Sometimes you might be asked later on, if you go into a counseling career, for example, to think about your clinical style. Which perspective do you embrace the most? Which one makes the most sense to you? And which one do you see being able to fit on top of people's situations in which they need help? So we'll review and apply a lot of these perspectives in psychology to the specific example of personality psychology. But first, a quick true and false. Astrology is not a very good predictor of personality. Graphology or handwriting is still used in some countries across the world. Whether you have big loops or small loops, whether you have long crosses of T's or short crosses of T's, has been interpreted as meaningful, although statistically it doesn't seem to be useful in any way. People's drawings, such as the drawing a person test or other art therapy, is that clinically useful in terms of understanding someone's personality? Not really. At least there's no data I know to support that. There's also the idea of national character. For example, that Chinese are very deferent, or that Germans are aggressive and strict. Unfortunately, that's false. There are some different cultural differences, but that's different from saying that there's a typical personality type characteristic of a culture. There's often the belief that people who are obese are more jolly or cheerful than non-obese people. If anything, they happen to be a little more depressed on average. And as you might see, there is a strong pattern here. Birth order is also going to support this pattern. That's false. So the firstborn is often viewed as being dominant, type A, and then the secondborn is often thought to be more likely to be submissive and outgoing and relaxed. But in truth, the statistics don't support any of these things. So what this means is you may look at some of the personality tests that we have and that we use and think, I'm not too impressed by this. However, consider the alternatives. Most of the alternative theories out there have maybe zero validity, even though the test that we'll talk about here might not have as high a validity as we'd like. At least it's something, and it's better than the mostly zero validity that we see for this collection of different historical ways to view personality. One example that I thought would be interesting would be to apply personality into something that maybe we don't think about very often, but has a direct correlation to our likelihood to be infected or to be carrying and be in contact with certain germs and potentially bacteria. And this is hand hygiene behaviors. So think about, how clean are your hands at this moment? How much thought have you given to whether your hands are clean or not? This research was done in cooperation with some people from grad school, my advisor and some colleagues. And this was funded by the Gojo Corporation. If you're not familiar with them, they are the parent company of the Purell brand of hand hygiene sanitizers and soaps. And they've done a lot of research in strong situations in the medical setting. So for example, pre and post-op, a surgeon would have strict rules about what they're expected to do to maintain hand hygiene. And it's a matter of, in a strong situation, do you follow the rules or not? And not surprisingly, most of them do. Although I was surprised at the rates of non-adherence of doctors to hand hygiene regimens, but that's for another story. But we also want to expand this issue out toward non-medical settings or weaker situations. For example, when you use a public bathroom, You can choose whether to wash your hands or whether to not to, and you won't be punished if you choose not to. But most cases, if we care about public health, we want to be around people who are more likely to do hand hygiene behaviors, who are not likely to leave disgusting things on handles and doorknobs, for example. So one way that you could predict who is likely or not likely to do hand hygiene behaviors would be to use personality. And so we covered some examples of personality. One would be socially desirable practices. So we're dividing hand hygiene into those that everybody would admit to. If I asked you, do you wash your hands after using the bathroom? Most people would say yes, right? And it's partly because I don't want to look like the slob in the room. But you also have discrete practices, such as after handling money, after touching food, after touching a doorknob. Do you think about your hand hygiene? And not surprisingly, fewer people do these discrete practices, but we also wanted to predict who's going to do those. And we found those who were focused on preventing getting sick. So these are the people who are always thinking about not getting sick, and they have a collective identity. So they're not just focused on themselves, but they're more focused on the activities and the thoughts and behaviors of the people around them. Whereas those who did the socially desirable practices were focused about keeping healthy, focused on themselves primarily, and this individual identity. So if they do hand hygiene, they are doing it for their own benefit and for their own looking good if they have to talk about their hand hygiene. So what are the implications of this? Well, if you're an organization and public health is a concern to you, you might want to select people who are more likely to do these discrete practices. So you might want to include in the application battery of tests a measure of prevention focus, health prevention focus, and collective identity. And the more of these kind of people you hire, the more you're going to see discrete practices, the little things that can really make a big difference in terms of hand hygiene and the transmission of germs and bacteria. So now let's dig into some of the common, more contemporary perspectives of personality. One of the biggest, perhaps the biggest today, is the trait perspective. Basically, a trait says it's just something you have. It doesn't do very well in explaining how it got there. All it does is say, as an adult, you have this set of traits, and we will measure them for you, usually through a self-survey or a personality inventory, or we can ask other people, have them fill out some surveys to get maybe multiple people evaluating your personality. And again, the focus is on description. We don't have much theory for why these traits are important. We just know that the research seems to suggest that they exist and that we can measure them. So we have here the common personality inventory. And as you might imagine, it is a big commercial industry, just like the intelligence testing industry is also big. And oftentimes, the real value of the ones that are good and more expensive is not that they look fancy or look cutting edge or have special items. It's just because they have mountains and mountains of historical data, which allow you to more precisely place one person relative to other people regarding that trait. So again, a lot of these tests that cost the most are good because they have so much data that they can give you more precise estimates about where you fit relative to other people in their database. The trait perspective asks the question, how do these traits get here? And we might think initially we would start with theory, saying that we think there has to be an extroversion introversion dimension. That's got to be there no matter what. But that's not how this came to be. Instead, a lot of people said, I don't like the progress that the Freudian perspective, psychoanalytic perspective has made. We can talk about the superego and the id, but since by definition they're unconscious and we can't ask people about how much of each they have, I don't know where to go with this. So instead, some of the researchers who started the trait perspective said personality kind of sounds like adjectives, just ways to describe people. Someone's fun or boring or outgoing or reserved. So they went through the dictionary and came up with a whole bunch of adjectives, thousands of them, and then they had these poor initial participants say applies to me or doesn't, yes or no. And once they got a lot of this data, they would then do statistical analyses, factor analyses, that basically said which of these adjectives seem to stick together. So once again, they weren't coming out theoretically saying we need to have 3 or 5 or 10 personality factors. This is just the way these adjectives seem to stick together in the most identifiable clumps. And so you can argue perhaps that there are 6 or maybe a big 3, but most people generally now accept this big 5 dimensions. It's not perfect, but it seems to be better than the alternatives in many ways. So we have the neuroticism factor. So people who are neurotic, we know they're sort of anxious. We know they're a little unpredictable. So if you've ever seen Kramer from the TV show Seinfeld, he fits those descriptions. He would be high in neuroticism. We also have extroversion. Extroversion, we often think that it's being nice, but it's not about being nice. It is about being sociable and outgoing. So for example, salespeople often have to have high extroversion. They're the people who want to go out and meet people, be the first to shake their hand and learn their name, and try to influence them. Now, we also have what's known as openness, openness to experience. Are you a thrill seeker? Are you imaginative? Do you want to try new things? So often entrepreneurs will show a lot of openness to experience. So this is Richard Branson, founded Virgin Records, Virgin Airlines, and he's currently involved on missions to explore space, to explore the deep ocean. Does things like skydiving as well. Classic characteristics of somebody who's highly open to experience. We also have agreeableness. And this is where does somebody empathize with you? Are they soft-hearted? Are they trustful? Do they help you? Do they care about you? So, of course, House from the show House has very low agreeableness. He doesn't care how you feel. He'll call you a moron and not feel bad about it, even if it causes you to cry. And then finally, we have conscientiousness. This kind of shows how this Big 5 model, these factors were named decades ago. Now we'd probably just call this responsibility. Is someone organized and careful and timely? So Lisa Simpson would be a good example of somebody who has high conscientiousness. And once again, our interpretation is everybody has some level of these Big 5 traits. And it's just a matter of are they high and low and which ones? Sort of like an equalizer on a stereo. And this actually helped with a family issue. We thought a family member was in trouble, very emotionally unstable, and that we couldn't trust this person to deal with difficult situations. But instead, we've sort of figured it out that this person was very extroverted, liked to meet people, talk to people, know a lot of different things about people, but had low agreeableness, meaning that this person wasn't like a clinical sociopath or anything, but just wasn't able to meet an emotional connection with other people in a very deep way. That's just not what this person's personality suggested. And that in turn changes how we interpret this person's behavior and how we treat them. Meaning this person can deal with difficult situations in life, and you don't have to worry about this person being a threat to themselves or others. It just means that they won't be able to empathize with you, perhaps when you share bad news with them, in the way that somebody who is highly agreeable might be able to do. We also have another famous test that comes from the trait perspective. And once again, you don't have to remember the actual source of the acronym. All you just have to remember is the MMPI. This is one of the very, very most widely used personality tests, and it's used to identify emotional, psychological disorders. And you can see some of the subscales here for paranoia, hysteria, depression. We probably don't refer to hypochondriasis anymore, but that used to be a diagnosis. And for example, if someone is going to a clinic or counseling service before maybe meeting with the actual counselor or the cognitive psychologist, perhaps maybe they would take the MMPI. So they'd have sort of a baseline seeing here's where we think this person might be starting, some areas that they might have psychological disturbances with. It's also used as a diagnostic instrument to do, for example, before and after testing. So, for example, cutoffs are somewhat, you have to have a lot of justification for a cutoff as to when to decide someone has a clinically significant psychological disorder. But you can say before treatment, the MMPI shows that they are clinically diagnosable in the case of depression. And then after treatment, we see now that they have moved into the non-clinically depressed group, which basically shows that this treatment actually works. The interesting part about the MMPI is how it came to be. Once again, it was not based on theory, so they just took a bunch of questions, some of them sort of strange, and a lot of them have been taken out or revised in more recent versions. But basically they said, we think that there are two populations that have psychological disorders and populations that don't. So let's give a bunch of questions to these two populations, samples from these populations, and see which questions they answer differently. And so, not surprisingly, some questions such as seeing ghosts or talking to God or enjoying bowel movements, people with psychological disorders answered differently than those who did not have psychological disorders. So those items were retained into the final instrument. And once again, all it does is, we don't know why these questions get answered differently, but they do predict, not perfectly, but importantly, substantially, if someone has a psychological disorder or not. Now, it's interesting, given our history of personality, since this was a very popular test, many organizations wanted to use it in terms of hiring their employees. Dayton-Hudson Corporation is now named Target, which you might be familiar with, and they were sued in using the MMPI. And they ruled in favor of the plaintiff, and the ruling was that you cannot use something like the MMPI to select employees because it was designed to be a medical test, in this case to test whether someone has a psychological disorder or not. So today's standing is you can use a Big Five trait inventory in many ways, including to select employees, but you could not use the MMPI in terms of deciding whether you wanted to hire an employee or not. We also are interested in, where does our personality come from? How do we explain it, or how do we account for variability? And here we see 50%, and I think that's actually too convenient, and we look at the date. I'm sure there are more precise estimates now, but I still don't think we have a very good handle on where our personality comes from. So maybe a rough start is that half of it is heritable and that we can tie to our genes. It's important, and this is not for exam purposes, for example, but it doesn't mean that our personality individually is 50% from genes and 50% from our environment, but instead genes explain 50% of the personality variability in the whole population. So that might be higher or lower for certain individuals. So once again, this is our rough start of where does personality come from, although I think we have a lot more work to do. We can also use the trait perspective in a number of different ways. It doesn't have to be a personality inventory, although I would like to see the validity data for our toothpaste tube personality. I'm guessing the validity would not be high, which goes to show it's a challenge to come up with a personality test that actually works statistically. Let's change gears and talk about the humanistic perspective. Once again, the humanistic perspective says, let's not focus on what's wrong with people, like the psychodynamic perspective. Let's focus on what's good about people and how we can construct environments to get people to flourish. So a lot of the humanistic perspective was based on Abraham Maslow's theories, and he came up with this idea of self-actualization. And he took some people historically, you see some of the big names here, even Freud, interestingly, and said that they possessed this level of self-actualization, which all people strive for. It's a universal need in terms of being human. What does it look like, though? Well, It is when you've made a very substantial contribution to humanity in a way that fits with your values and your unique gifts as a person. Or another way to use it would be fulfilling one's full potential. And of course, since we each have different constellations of the things that we can contribute best, self-actualization would look very different for me compared to anybody else, right? So the idea of self-actualization is a little bit squishy. It's hard to measure. It's more of a theoretical concept. But I think when we see it in relation to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we see that, first of all, we need basic physiological needs. We need to have food. We need to have sanitary conditions to live in. Then we need safety, right? We need to know that we can sleep at night without having to worry about getting shot or getting robbed. Once we have that, we then have social needs. We need to have people around us that we love. But then, that's not good enough either. We need to then feel like we're important relative to our social surroundings. We need to feel like people look up to us or that we're really contributing. And then once we've done that, then we can get to self-actualization. The important thing for us to remember is that according to Maslow, most people keep bumping around between these basic things. So once you get to maybe esteem, maybe like President of the United States, for example, there's no more important title in terms of name recognizability that you can get on our planet at the moment. And so it's not uncommon that former presidents, they have no further place to climb up to fulfill their esteem needs. If being president doesn't fulfill your esteem, then I don't know what comes next. But often then, that's when people then focus on self-actualization. So we can talk about Bill Gates donating a lot of his fortune to curing malaria and other illnesses. We could talk about former presidents, Bush and Clinton, for example. After becoming president, they don't go into business. They actually spend a lot of their time with philanthropical endeavors, trying to help people in terms of education or public health. Maslow's views, especially on the concept of self-esteem, gained a lot of attention, especially in the 70s. And it was really a belief that our children are not achieving what we want them to achieve in school, and a big causal factor of that is low self-esteem. Unfortunately, since the 70s, we've got a lot of research to show that self-esteem is not necessary nor sufficient for depression. And really, self-esteem is not the reason why people smoke or abuse alcohol or drugs. It might be somewhat important, but it's not nearly as important as it was hypothesized to be. Now, we can also argue this might have something to do with how self-esteem is measured, or do we need to go back and think theoretically? Are we really specifying it as it plays out in humanity? But basically, self-esteem, the idea that we're loved, that we're valued, tends to not play out as importantly in terms of whether our lives are good or bad. It's something we all need to have a reasonably high self-esteem. But when things go bad, there are lots of other reasons to explain why things went bad than just having low self-esteem. You can also think about, why do you work? Well, if you're working for the money, chances are you're working to fulfill lower steps in Maslow's hierarchy, to put food on the table, to put a roof over your kids. What's it like to be self-actualized, though? Perhaps having a job that you're addicted to, that you love, that you feel maximizes your unique talents and contributions. One of the major criticisms of the humanistic perspective and self-actualization, though, is that self-actualization doesn't always have to be good. And if somebody chooses to self-actualize in a very evil way, what does that mean? Does that mean that society has failed? Or does that mean that we just have this potential for evil that the humanistic perspective really can't account for in terms of self-actualization? So some people have suggested that potentially Hitler reached self-actualization because he was so effective and really thought he was uniquely capable of unleashing his vision of humanity, which of course most anyone else would not view as self-actualization. We've also extended the humanistic perspective that Maslow built into clinical value. And so Carl Rogers was a clinical psychologist that focused on some similar humanistic concepts such as growth, fulfillment, and especially acceptance and empathy. So he came up with these two related sources of self-esteem. What makes us feel good? What makes us feel valuable in a certain situation? And I suppose I should be clear. Self-esteem is not just about a certain situation. Self-esteem is more global. In general, I'm a good person. I'm a valuable person. And I feel that way at school, at home, with family, with friends. Going back to Rogers, we have, first of all, unconditional positive regard. One simple way would be come home, doesn't matter if you were good or bad at work or did well or poorly on a test, your puppy wants to see you and just loves you because you're you. And it's unconditional. It doesn't matter what you've done. It's not conditional on your performance. It's a total acceptance of your value as a person. Contrast that with conditional positive regard, and that is only given when you succeed. So for example, if you play poorly, you get benched. If you play well, you get compliments, you get maybe rewards from your parents or your coaches, right? It's conditional on what you do. So Rogers would say too much of our society is this conditional positive regard. And what we need to do is make sure everybody has some source of unconditional positive regard, which will keep their self-esteem afloat. And of course, in normal, healthy schools and families, children will have plenty of ways to get unconditional positive regard. Their family loves them no matter what. There's someone they can talk to, a friend or a counselor at school that they can always talk to. But Rogers viewed the therapeutic setting as a place for people who don't have any other source of unconditional positive regard, for that person to go and find someone who will accept them, who will empathize with them, who will try to understand what they're dealing with and not judge them. We also have sort of the social cognitive perspective. In some ways, it's based on the behavioral perspective. So we're looking at observational learning concepts, and we can look at how a person's natural personality interacts with the person or the situation that they find themselves in. So we take someone who's maybe highly open to experience, to use the openness Big Five factor, and then we put them with other people who are highly open to experience in a situation where they have opportunities to do this. And not surprisingly, when we combine those two things, we have a very open to experience behavior, very uninhibited behavior. What this means also is if we have someone who is at risk for depression or substance abuse, and then we put them with people who are depressed and abusing substances, these two factors interact to amplify the behavior that we see. What this means is it's a very rational approach to say, look, if you have a personality factor that's going to lead to potential bad outcomes, you need to avoid these certain environments to prevent that personality from playing out as it would so that it doesn't get amplified. And so that's what the social cognitive perspective can show us. We also have the related concept of self-efficacy. And unlike self-esteem, which is a sort of global and general value of yourself, self-efficacy instead is very situation specific, meaning given this goal, given this situation, can I achieve success? So what this means is you are actually saying, my goal is to get a job, for example. And I feel like I can't get a job. I don't have the skills. No one wants me. There are no jobs. So how do we build up self-efficacy? Similar to the little engine that could, we start small, right? We start with the attitude, I think I can, I think I can. And when people say that and actually believe it, they start to get momentum and they start achieving their goal. And it starts small. So for example, I worked with an organization called Mature Services. I did some internships there, and they specifically help with people who are over age 55. One division was their employment services for older workers looking for jobs. And many of these workers were low income, low education. They couldn't really type in many cases. They didn't know how to use computers or web browsers or mice even. And they would come in and say, all these jobs are online. I can't use a computer. I have no chance, right? And we could teach them the skills, but what they really needed was the push to get started before learning the skills. So they had this, what was called a job club, and they would meet once a week. And at first, they would be complaining about how the system was rigged against them and how this was pointless. But all it took was one person to say, okay, we're going to do learning how to use a computer mouse. And most people would say, I can't do it. Someone would jump up and say, okay, I'll give it a try. And what do you know? The other people would watch this person learning how to use a mouse, next week learning how to use a computer, a week later being able to complete a job application on the computer, and say, if that person can do it, I can do it too. Observational learning. Also, we have this sort of escalating model of goals. We start with very simple things, and there's some momentum that I start with a simple thing, I knock that goal off the list, now I'm ready to do the next goal. It's a little bit harder, but since I did the last thing, I think I can do this. And so when you combine these two forces of seeing others and knowing you can do what they do, and also starting and having just small successes that build into big things, those are the conditions that lead to building up self-efficacy. So for example, if somebody says they can't get a date, I'm a loser, no one likes me, no one finds me attractive, it's going to be tough to get them a date, right? But you have to start small. So first of all, you'd say, okay, well, what are some things that you could change about your appearance? What are some things that you could work on in terms of meeting people? Not just to try and get a date or play the game, but instead to try and improve the way people perceive you, right? Maybe get them to try and start online, posting a profile. And so slowly they build up to actually meeting someone, to getting a date. And the first date might not go well, but if they have self-efficacy, they'll continue to try. And that's how self-efficacy will work. It can also work the opposite. So for example, bad things happen to good people, oftentimes beyond their control. It matters then how they respond or how they make attributions to those bad things that happen to them. And if they say, look, the world is just against me now, everything is going bad. So first of all, I lost my job, and now I'm sick, and now I'm behind on my rent. It doesn't matter what I do, the cards are stacked against me. We have what's called generalized helpless behavior or learned helplessness. And this is the attitude that nothing I do matters. I have such low self-efficacy that anytime I try, it won't lead to success, it won't be rewarded. So what the social cognitive perspective says is we need to intervene right here to say, look, yes, you didn't have control over those bad events, but you do have control over what you do today. And what that means is you can beat this sickness. You can get a new job. And there may be a good reason that you lost that previous job. Maybe you didn't like it, and this can be an opportunity to try something new. So with the social cognitive perspective, as you can guess from cognitive, we need to change the way people think. And often it's very rational stuff. But oftentimes, once again, when people are thinking irrationally, it doesn't feel irrationally to them. They need someone else to be able to see it and call them out on it to start the change. We can also talk about personality in reference to the cultural perspective, more specifically, which culture and kind of culture that we grew up in. And it's less thinking about how our culture shapes the way we act, but more about how relevant personality is in different kinds of cultures. And there are lots of different ways that we could categorize cultures, but the most common for us would be collectivist versus individualist. And in westernized cultures, personality just makes more sense because we describe ourselves as I am this, and this is how I'm going to act across situations. This is who I am and how I behave. On the other hand, for more Eastern, to use a very general term here, it's less common to say I am this because how you think and act is dependent on matching, if you're thinking holistically, the context of how the other people around you are thinking and acting. And so personality is just more flexible and less consistent in Eastern or collectivist cultures. So individualists basically define themselves based on who I am, what I like, and that's why I'm valuable. And so you can see our self-esteem is directly tied to things about me. Contrast that with collectivists, who are more likely to define themselves based on who they are with, typically their family. So you can break down collectivists. Some research has broken this down into collectivists and relational. So for example, China would be a classic collectivist culture because they define themselves mostly based on country affiliation, whereas Japanese are more likely to define themselves based on their family. But it's the same general pattern. So for example, instead of saying, I have high self-esteem because I'm good at this, you're likely to see a lot more of me and my and we statements. Because when you're saying we, you are thinking about your group, and that's where you get your self-esteem. So for example, ask an individualist, why are you working at your current job? Because I like this and because I'm good at that. Collectivists, why are you working at your job? They might be more likely to say, well, because we support our community this way, and we take care of our workers, and we have these values at this company. And so it's a very different way of understanding personality. And in many cases, personality is pretty common in the United States, but it's seen as sort of weird to give a personality test to those in collectivist cultures, because if they're answering these items, I'm responsible, they have to think about it in terms of the different contexts in which they might see themselves. So they'd say, well, I'm responsible at work, but not responsible when I'm out with friends, and I don't know how you want me to answer this question. So once again, the very idea of personality just makes more sense from an individualist perspective. We also have some measurement concepts that we might want to think about. How do we measure personality? And what are the important statistical or conceptual things that we want to think about? First of all, especially if we're talking about traits, basically they follow what we call a normal curve, often called the bell curve because it looks like a right side up bell. And what we find out is that most of the people fall in the middle 60 to 70% of this curve. So if we're talking about one personality trait such as extroversion, most people will be a little bit above or a little bit below average, and only fewer and fewer people will have extremely high or extremely low extroversion. That leads into this next concept of standardization. So we have, for example, a personality test, and we give it to you, and your absolute number probably won't make much sense. Well, you've got a 9 on extroversion. Okay. What you really want to know is, where does that put me relative to other people? And that's where standardization comes in. So once again, the value of standardized tests is partly because they've got a lot of data and they've continued to improve the kind of questions they have to more specifically target what they're trying to target. But the other value is they have tons of data. And what that allows you to do is have more precise estimates of where your specific number fits relative to everybody else like you who has taken that same test. So standardization, as you can see, gives scores meaning. It says, where do they fall relative to everybody else. So similar logic, we can see this is the Wechsler intelligence test, again, the gold standard for intelligence measuring. And we see that only 0.1 of the population will have IQs over 145 or severely mentally retarded on the low end of IQ. So again, most people fall near the middle. And then you have some maybe debates about cutoffs. At what point do you call someone gifted versus call someone retarded? Typically, it has to do with 2 standard deviations below and above the mean. But you can also argue for maybe other reasons to move these cutoffs above or below in terms of when we would label someone. And how does this apply to personality? Well, for example, if you're hiring for a sales position, you might decide that you need to have people who are only in the top 5% of extroversion for your sales team. They have to be much more extroverted than the average person. So then you could have your extroversion test and only interview people who meet the cutoff that you've introduced. We also have another couple of issues when we're talking about, does the data support whether personality seems to be doing something meaningful? And we have the related concepts of reliability and validity. Reliability is first consistency. So you take a personality test once, you take it a week later, how well do those scores match? And the less that they match, the less reliability there is. And in the event that there's super low reliability, how do you know which score is accurate? Well, you don't. And so that means there can be no validity if we don't first establish reliability. Once we have a consistent measure, this means then we can think about, well, just because it's consistent doesn't mean it's really getting at what we want it to get at. So then we have to think about the more complex issue of validity. And we can relate this to shooting targets at a bullseye. So for example, here we see consistency. It's reliable, but it's not valid because this is your goal. Now let's ignore this because that is not valid or reliable. Here we see it's less reliable than this, right? And it's also not valid because you're not hitting the bullseye. But here we see reliability and also validity because not only is it consistent, but it's also consistent in what we want it to be. Now, if we're measuring personality, we don't have an objective target, right? It's hard to say this measure really shows that this person is conscientious or responsible. And so we have to look at other ways besides targets to think about validity. So one aspect would be content validity. So in this case, does the test contain questions that make sense relative to what it's testing for? So of course, for applying for a certain job, if you're applying to be a firefighter, you would want to see questions about firefighting techniques and equipment. That would be content valid. Also similar to face validity. Basically, this is one maybe simpler way or more pop psychology way of thinking about content validity. So of course, for the firefighter exam, if you were taking the SAT, questions about analogies and word problems and math problems, you would wonder, what does that content have to do with my firefighting ability? We also have predictive validity. So for example, if the SAT is low in content validity, meaning that the kind of questions on that you're probably not going to be answering when you're actually on the job, what is the value? Why do we use it? Because it has shown to be statistically predictive of an important outcome. So this means for a test to have predictive validity, we have to have the data. We have to have test scores, and we have to have some outcome, such as job performance or success in grad school, or passing the bar exam, or any number of things. So we see some common examples of validity estimates. Graduate record exam predicting graduate GPA. It predicts, but it's not super high, right? This is a low correlation. There's a lot of other things about graduate GPA that this exam does not account for. Now we also have SAT predicting college GPA. And here we see a little bit better, right? But still not super impressive. Think about things like medical tests. You know, CT scan, you're looking at detailed images of body parts, and you think we'd have near 100% predictive validity. Either you see the tumor or you don't, right? Is it there or it's not? The problem is that CT scans, even though detailed, they can't see cellular level cancer cells, for example. And so, for example, you might not see a tumor, but there is actually cancer present, right? And so any test will not have perfect predictive validity, but the goal is always to get that validity higher and higher, whether it's through better training of the people reading the instrument, or whether it's new instruments and changes to the process. But once again, our personality tests, compared to medical tests, compared to intelligence tests, just don't predict that well. They're not worthless, and these are all better than projective tests, for example. Personality inventories, maybe at the very best, could have a maybe 0.3 correlation with job performance. So that's kind of the state of affairs. Personality is relevant, it does predict, but man, there's got to be, hopefully, a way to bump up that predictive validity. Let's do a quick review. Here we see the case study of Jack, who looks like he might be showing signs of a psychological disorder. Which test would we use? Almost certainly MMPI relative to the others. Projective tests, historically, they've had use in clinical settings. Data hasn't supported it, so now typically they do not get used in terms of meaningful clinical diagnosis in these kind of settings. And you probably wouldn't make a diagnosis just based on MMPI score. You'd probably have that diagnosis supplemented by having a meeting in person with a trained clinician or clinical psychologist. So here we see Wesley, who is a juvenile delinquent, yet the pastor continues to accept him, continues to see that he has value, that he has potential. So where would this positive attitude, trying to boost this person's self-esteem, offer unconditional positive regard? Maslow or Rogers, either one would be correct, because those are the two aligned with the humanistic perspective. If we look at the consequences of self-efficacy, individuals with low self-efficacy are more likely to feel depressed and less likely to delay gratification. So think about this in terms of weight loss. Do you have a belief that trying to eat better and exercise more will lead to losing weight? Well, if you do, you have high self-efficacy. If you don't, if you have low self-efficacy, you are more likely to feel depressed and you are less likely to delay gratification. An example would be, I'm hungry and I know there's ice cream in the fridge. Should I just go for it or should I wait? Well, if you have low self-efficacy, you think that even if you do resist temptation, it won't matter. You're just going to go for that ice cream and not have any delay of gratification. You're going to give in to your id, so to speak. We can relate to the social psych concept of reciprocation. Basically, Mr. Maloney starts with a trust in his employees, treats them nicely. They in turn reciprocate that and work harder, which causes him to trust them more. And this is a classic social cognitive feedback loop, meaning that your behavior can be picked up by the people around you and can influence their behavior in a positive feedback loop. Of course, this could work the opposite way in a negative feedback loop. If Mr. Maloney is distrustful, his employees then would act in accordance in distrustful ways, and then he would then become more distrustful of them. So the social cognitive loops can work either for the good or for the bad. How are Japanese students more likely to identify themselves? And if you say any of the above, that's true, because these are all collective or group type of affiliations. We this, we that, whereas American students are much more likely to say, I'm good at this and I want that. Quick true false as we wrap things up. So this is false because self-efficacy and self-esteem are different. Self-esteem is our general global value of our goodness, our value to our community and our family. Self-efficacy is situation specific. In this situation with this goal, do I believe that my behavior will help me achieve this goal? Once again, extroversion is not how nice someone is. That would be agreeableness. Extroversion instead is how likely are you to want to go out and meet people, learn things about them, and influence them? This is true. Basically, you get a 90% on an exam in this class. You know that maybe you're happy with that grade because that's an A, but it doesn't tell you whether everybody else got an A too. And so if you're just concerned about the grade, knowing that raw score would be fine. If you're concerned about where you are relative to other people, you would want you're looking for some standardizing information. This is false. The stronger the situation, the more the situational forces overwhelm our personality influence. But when personality really comes out is in weak situations, when we're not feeling strong situational forces. We can act in the way that we think our personality would dictate. This is generally true. It takes a lot of research, a lot of background work to establish reliability, acceptable reliability and validity, both content and predictive. And a lot of what you pay for a test is not just what you see in the questions they ask, but the data that supports them being there and that helps interpret the results that they provide. So of course, if you find a 5-minute free personality test on Facebook, chances are it will not have very good reliability or validity. This is often viewed as true that divorce causes undesirable personality expression in children. Research shows that that's generally not true. Divorce can result in other undesirable things, but it doesn't really change a child's personality. So a quick case study, a little history lesson in terms of the employment context. In the 1960s, prominent Bowling Green professor wrote an article basically saying that personality should not be used in employment context, job applicant context at all, because at that time there was a lot of work with projective tests and the MMPI, and these researchers from Bowling Green were very influential in getting personality out of the workplace. However, in the late 80s and early 90s, personality came back because there were what we call some of these meta-analyses, which took a whole bunch of separate individual studies and averaged them into big general numbers. Here's the average predictive validity of extroversion in predicting job performance, for example. And the numbers weren't great, but they were good enough to continue exploration. And so throughout the 90s, tons of research was done linking personality and the workplace. And this were some of the most influential researchers in generating all this personality test research, and also basically scrounging together any personality test research they could get their hands on so that they could meta-analyze it again. And what we see here is looking at the 5-factor model conscientiousness, how responsible you are, is a valid predictor across performance in all occupations. So for any job, people who are more responsible have better job performance than people who are not responsible. Let's extend that out to the other big 5 traits. Extroversion, openness, and agreeableness did not predict overall work performance across, but they did in specific occupations. So for example, extroversion will predict sales, openness to experience will predict entrepreneurial success, and agreeableness, for example, will predict success in customer service effectiveness, because they are the people who care to help people with their problems. Also, interestingly enough, they call for a moratorium on meta-analytic studies. So they believed that their meta-analysis was the biggest and the best, and so everybody else stopped because we've done all that needs to be done. And if you can imagine, their advice was not listened to, because there's been tons more personality meta-analyses in trying to predict different aspects of job performance in the subsequent years. But that's enough of our presentation for today. So looking forward to discussing some of these aspects of personality. Which perspectives do you happen to find most helpful or most relevant to the way you think and act? What do you think about the different emphases in terms of, we have a situation, we think it's a personality importance to understand what's going on with this person's personality. Which perspective would help you the most? Which perspective would you cross out and not even think about? And also, how can you apply some personality to how personality is played out in your life and in the family and friends that you know well? So looking forward to discuss all this and more on the discussion boards.